This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 12. Welcome to the 12th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Lisa from FertilityFriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Please stop by the blog and leave a comment if you enjoyed today's show. You'll find the show notes for today's episode and all the podcast episodes at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. And you can find me on Twitter at FertileFriday, so please tweet me if you enjoyed today's show. In today's episode, I'm very excited to be talking with Laura Schoenfeld. You may know her from the work that she's done with Chris Kresser. Laura is a registered dietitian who has her master's in public health nutrition. Laura is the founder of ancestralizeme.com, and she is passionate about making traditional diets healthful and accessible for all of her clients. Laura promotes the use of an ancestral diet to achieve optimal health and wellness. She is passionate about educating people about the benefits of high-quality fat and properly raised animal products in the diet, as well as eliminating industrial foods like polyunsaturated vegetable oils and refined grains, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. She believes that the same health and nutrition principles that apply to avoiding chronic disease can also be applied to supporting overall health, beauty, and fitness. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Laura.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here today. And so I did a short intro, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your practice and what inspired you to focus on nutrition and ancestral health principles in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, there's a lot of different things that have led me to where I am today. And the most basic of those things is the fact that I was brought up in a household where my mother is actually a registered dietitian. She hasn't been for that long. I mean, by that long, I mean less than 10 years. But she's always been really interested in nutrition, and she raised our family eating in a way that was very different from my friends. When I was younger, I didn't appreciate it. And in fact, a lot of times I was a little freaked out by some of the foods she would bring home. Raw milk is one that stands out to me as being a very scary thing to see in your fridge when you're used to grocery store 1% milk. But, as time went on, it kind of became normal, and we would eat lots of grass-fed dairy products and grass-fed meats, and not worrying about low fat at all, just being very, liberal with whatever type of real food we were eating. And then when I went to college, I kind of realized that, I knew that we ate differently, but I didn't realize how differently. And seeing all my friends eating in a way that I was just shocked that they thought was, I don't know if they thought it was healthy, but they thought it was something that they could do, not like, just as part of their daily life. And I started to get passionate about sharing my knowledge about nutrition. At that time, it wasn't really that scientific necessary. It was just more, oh, you don't have to worry about fat. You don't have to worry about egg yolks. Those are all healthy foods. Don't worry that red meat's bad for you, that kind of thing. And as time went on, I started to get more interested in learning about the actual science behind the recommendations and more specifics. So I lived in Australia for a year and a half, and that was kind of when my interest in nutrition really got solidified, because I found where I was living in Australia, they were really into health and fitness. I used to go to a little cafe where we would talk about nutrition and what we thought was the real information about nutrition. And I just found that I really enjoyed sharing my knowledge and talking with other people about what kind of things most Americans and Australians wouldn't know as far as nutrition goes. So now I was in my program for 2.5 years. So it's been about 3 years since I started my formal education in nutrition. As you'd mentioned, I had been working for Chris Kresser for almost that whole time. So I had a pretty steep incline as far as the learning curve is concerned. But, there's a lot of stuff that special interest topics that I've gotten into in the last couple of months and years that I really am passionate about. And one of those would be fertility. Mm-hmm. And women's health, I guess, would be a broader term.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so fortunate that you were able to kind of take for granted growing up in a household eating all those quote unquote weird foods that turn out to be super healthy and incredibly nutrient dense. So It's interesting how our paths lead us to where we end up.
Yeah, I was
So
just going to say a lot of people come from the opposite direction where they were doing what my friends were doing and then
yeah.
they realized it was wrong. So I don't have that radical transformation story, but in some ways it made it easier for me to know what this kind of diet looked like and not be afraid of it.
Okay, well, let's dive in and talk about what exactly is an ancestral diet and what makes it different from a typical North American diet.
Sure. Well, so I like the term ancestral because it doesn't pigeonhole people as much as a term like paleo. If your listeners are familiar with the paleo diet, sometimes when you hear that word, you think, oh, it's just food that a caveman would eat. So I like the paleo perspective from a scientific standpoint, but as far as the diet itself, I think it can be a little bit excessively restrictive because they'll use the belief that, oh, because this food wasn't available 100,000 years ago, you shouldn't eat it, which I think is a little bit of a false way to describe a diet.
Hmm.
So the ancestral perspective that I take has more to do with eating in a way that you could see your ancestors maybe 200 years ago eating, or even I would say 100 years ago in some cultures. Um, I'd say the major differences between my concept of an ancestral diet and the typical North American diet would be the types and amounts of fats used for sure. So, like you said, not being afraid of fat and especially not being afraid of animal fats from properly raised animals like grass-fed dairy, pastured chickens, that kind of stuff. Um, focusing on animal fats as your one of your primary sources of fat and not limiting it. So certainly not going on any of these low fat, fat-free kind of diets. And then I'd say another big difference is the elimination of most refined foods. I feel that most people in North America tend to rely pretty heavily on packaged foods as a large portion of their diet. And my philosophy is that, the less ingredients on a label or, label-free foods would be ideal. So that's things like fruits and vegetables, fresh meats and fish, um, pastured eggs, uh, root vegetables like sweet potatoes, white potatoes, even things like white rice, which would be a more whole food than something like, you know, I shouldn't use brands necessarily, but like boxed macaroni and cheese or these kind of bread products that have 50 different ingredients on the label. So that's a very broad difference as far as what the major differences are, but really it's just focusing on eating minimal ingredients, cooking from scratch, not being afraid of traditional foods like egg yolks and whole milk and that kind of stuff, butter and all those things that people think is just going to line your arteries. Um, and when I say ancestral, that doesn't necessarily prescribe a specific macronutrient ratio. So that means it's not low carb or low fat. It's really just based on what you do best with as far as your personal metabolism goes. And certain ancestral diets, like for example, most Asian diets tend to be higher carb. So if somebody does well with a higher carb diet, I don't have any problem with that. So I think it's a little bit more liberal than something like a paleo diet, but it still uses a lot of their principles as far as what, you know, what an actual real food diet looks like.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, and I one of the things I could completely imagine the listeners thinking, because as much as I've been exposed to all this information, and I have no problem eating lots of fat, but when I talk about that, so for example, when I tell people that I cook my eggs in butter or coconut oil, or when I tell people that I eat 10% yogurt, I get these weird looks, and people ask me if eating fat is going to make me fat. And so, as much as the information about fats is changing, there's still this. I think most people still feel that eating fat is going to make you fat. So
hmm
maybe you could talk a little bit about just that whole misconception and why fat is not just healthful but necessary when it comes to fertility and health in general.
Yeah, well, so fat's one of those weird macronutrients that in the ancestral community that I primarily work with, most people are almost in the opposite direction where they may be just adding fat to everything and maybe getting more fat than they actually need. Now, that's not to say fat's bad, but there's, I tend to try to make sure people aren't just eating isolated fat for no reason. Whereas I think the majority of people from a traditional or conventional nutritional approach would at least say to minimize fat. And I think, unfortunately, the message has gotten to the public where they feel that avoiding fat as much as possible would be ideal. Um, Without going into too much biochemistry, fat is a nutrient that is extremely important for just general health, if not fertility, and certainly fertility is a huge health concern that fat is important for. Um, Hormones are women's hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Those hormones are actually constructed from fat. So the molecule cholesterol, which most people associate with heart disease, and people tend to have this belief that the lower cholesterol you have, the better. Your body actually uses cholesterol to create those hormones. So if you don't eat enough fat and your body is not able to produce enough cholesterol, or if you're on a cholesterol suppressing medication, your body won't necessarily have the building blocks it needs to make hormones. So when I'm working with my female clients, especially young women in their 20s, 30s, even 40s, I like to see their cholesterol in the low to mid 200s, which most doctors would look at that and tell them it was too high. And I've had some patients, especially the ones in the slightly older age range, where their doctor was going to try to put them on a statin when their cholesterol was, say, 230, 240. Um, and my perspective, based on the evidence that I've seen and based on traditional cholesterol levels in hunter-gatherer cultures, I actually think low to mid 200s is the perfect cholesterol level for a woman, especially one that's looking to get pregnant. So as far as being afraid of cholesterol, being afraid of fat, you need fat to make hormones. So that's basically about the highest level explanation I can give. And then certainly if there's interest in the biochemical structure of hormones, there's a lot of information about that online. So if people are interested, I would suggest looking into that. Chris Masterjohn is someone that writes a lot about hormones and cholesterol. So I would recommend his work if people are interested in more of the nitty-gritty science details.
Well, I'll definitely link some of that information. I'll do some research and link to the show notes. I think that that's such a good point that you make, that cholesterol is required to make hormones, because so many women are struggling with hormonal imbalances and all kinds of things when it comes to fertility, and not knowing that basic fact that you need fat to manufacture hormones, I think is highly, problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things also, since we're talking about fats, maybe you could talk about the difference between fats. So we've talked a little bit about saturated fats, but most people still cook with olive oil and canola oil. So I often talk about just randomly, cook with coconut oil, and people look at me funny. And so maybe you could talk about why using unsaturated fats for cooking may not be as good for you as kind of sticking to the traditional fats like butter or whatever type of animal fat for cooking.
Sure. Well, so before I start, actually something we've learned in the last, I would say it's something I've learned in the last couple months, is that cooking with olive oil is actually not as bad as a lot of us thought it was. So, um, there's an article by Kelsey Marksteiner on Chris Kresser's blog about the evidence behind cooking with extra virgin olive oil. And what she explains is that it's actually not quite as bad as we thought it was, because olive oil in its, extra virgin first press state actually has a lot of antioxidants that protect it from oxidative damage. And when I say oxidative damage, that's what happens when you burn oil. Like if you've left oil in the pan too long and you start to see it smoking, that's called oxidation. Um, so an olive oil that's extra virgin will actually have antioxidants that protect it from that oxidation. So that was, like I said, something I had been recommending, don't cook with olive oil, for a long time. And recently, now that I learned that, I feel a little bit less concerned about specifically olive oil. Um, Now, other oils like canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil, vegetable oils in general, those don't those don't have the same kind of antioxidant amount as olive oil. and they're also a different type of fat. So olive oil is predominantly something called monounsaturated fat, whereas most other vegetable oils are actually polyunsaturated fat. And then you have saturated fat, which is things like butter, coconut oil, lard, tallow, that kind of animal, more solid fat. If you open your pantry, it's solid as opposed to liquid. Now, just to give you a very brief overview of the biochemistry of what those words mean, essentially, saturation just means the number of hydrogen bonds that are either double bonds or single bonds. When a fat is fully saturated, all of the bonds are single bonds, and there's as many hydrogen molecules attached to that fat as possible. So it makes the fat solid, it makes it kind of more stiff as far as the molecule goes. A monounsaturated fat has one double bond. So that means there's a little kink in the fat. It makes it a little bit more fluid. And I'm making these little hand motions as I'm talking, and I'm like, I wish your listeners could see what I'm doing. So basically, if you take your hands and just make like an L shape, that's the shape of the monounsaturated fat. So then when you have a polyunsaturated fat, that has multiple double bonds. And if you kind of make like an S and do like a little wave motion with your hands, that's what a polyunsaturated fat will do. So that's why that fat stays liquid. If you'll notice in a salad dressing that doesn't go hard in the fridge, whereas olive oil will go hard when it gets in the fridge, they just have different levels of flexibility and structure. So one of the reasons why polyunsaturated fats are actually more susceptible to damage is because they have so many of those double bonds. It actually allows them to get damaged easier than something like a saturated fat, which is fully hydrogenated and doesn't have as much room to get oxidized. Like I said, this is a very brief overview, so if anyone's actually knowledgeable about biochemistry, I apologize for making this sound so simple. But so the whole point is that saturated fat is actually a very stable, safe fat, especially at high temperatures, whereas something like a polyunsaturated fat is highly prone to damage. And depending on the type of polyunsaturated fat, if it's already been processed, so something like canola oil, soybean oil, corn oil, it's already probably damaged by the time you're even putting it in the pan. So certain foods like nuts and seeds have some polyunsaturated fats in them, but they're not heated, so they don't have that damage just starting out. So a little bit in your diet is actually good, but using lots of polyunsaturated fats to cook with actually exposes you to a lot of oxidative damage. It will lower your cholesterol, which is why a lot of doctors and dietitians will recommend it. But that's not a good thing, as we established before. Having low cholesterol when you're trying to have good fertility is not ideal. So that's a very brief overview of why polyunsaturated fats aren't good to eat or cook with. Um, I actually believe that of all the changes to our diet from the last 50 to 100 years, that our switch from saturated and monounsaturated fats to polyunsaturated fats was actually the worst thing that we did for our health. And I think it's probably underlying um, a lot of our cancer, a lot of our obesity, a lot of our chronic diseases, simply because those fats are so oxidized that they cause lots of inflammation in our bodies. And inflammation is one of the things that's at the root of almost any chronic disease, any underlying health issue. It's basically the worst thing that you can do is to eat foods that are inflammatory, and polyunsaturated omega-6 fats are one of those highly inflammatory foods.
And I would imagine that when you eliminate the packaged foods, as you had talked about earlier, because of course, most packaged foods, if you read the long list of ingredients, do include some sort of polyunsaturated fat.
hmm Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a product of the dietary guidelines in at least in our country. I think our American dietary guidelines have been a bad influence on most westernized countries. But basically, the food companies had to make changes to their formulas to fit these guidelines because, if something's high in saturated fat, people will start to avoid it if their doctors are telling them to avoid saturated fat. So the food companies changed their formulas. That's why they started using trans fats, which I think most people at this point know is really bad for you. The reason they started using trans fats is because they could get the same structure of the solid fat, kind of that flaky texture to pastries and a little bit more moist in baked goods, that kind of thing. But those fats are basically taking a polyunsaturated fat and adding on molecules in a way that's not natural, and your body can't use it, and it causes inflammation and structural issues. So basically, our fear of fat was what changed the fat in our food supply, and now it's really difficult to not get exposed to those unhealthy fats if you're eating packaged food.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's such great information. I'm so glad we talked about fats because I think that really demystifies a lot of the myths about saturated fat and why it's a good idea to consider incorporating it back into our diets. So I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the return of fertility. So for women who are on the birth control pill, I know you wrote an article a little while ago called Get Your Period Back, 5 Tips for Recovering from Post-Birth Control Syndrome. And so would you be able to talk a little bit about what post-birth control syndrome is and why it can be difficult for women to resume their cycles, quite quickly after coming off the pill?
Yeah, definitely. So I really like this topic because I actually see a fair number of patients in this situation. Just general infertility, not getting their period. A lot of them were on birth control for a period of time, and once they stopped, they actually stopped getting their period, or maybe they had lost it when they actually started the pill. So post-birth control syndrome, that's essentially when if you have a regular period on birth control, assuming you're, doing the placebo pills, and then you go off birth control either because you want to get pregnant or, some people realize there's risks to using birth control and they just want to stop using it. A lot of women will experience at least a couple months of either a lost period or spotting as opposed to a full period. There are some women who actually will not get their period back for months to even I've seen years. I had one patient that hadn't had her period in 8 years. So there's,
Wow.
that's not super common, but there are a lot of women who experience this lag time as far as getting their period back. Now, the reason for that is there's a lot of different reasons why that could be happening. Usually it's because there's some kind of hormonal imbalance, whether that be too much of one hormone or not enough of another. Estrogen and progesterone are two big hormones that do regulate the cycle. And if you're taking, it's called exogenous hormones, which just means outside hormones that are being put into your body, that can reduce the amount of endogenous hormones that your body's producing, which essentially just means the hormones that your body is using cholesterol to form either in your ovaries, your adrenal gland can produce some hormones. So once you remove that outside source of hormones, sometimes it takes a while for your body to start producing its own hormones again. There's a few different reasons for that. One is simply because when you take external hormones, your body will reduce its production to make sure you're not getting too many hormones. That's everyone's going to have that happen. So, that's something that just removing the extra hormone can get that back into balance. The other issues can actually be related to nutrient deficiency. So, there is some evidence that taking oral birth control pills can actually cause certain nutrients to become depleted. The reason for that is a little bit unsure. They're still looking into the evidence behind why that actually happens, but there are a few specific nutrients that have been studied and have been shown to actually become depleted while a woman is on an oral contraceptive. So these are the nutrients in particular I tend to focus on as far as supplements go, or at least making sure your diet is super rich in these nutrients. A little bit of therapeutic supplementation can be really helpful for kickstarting that process, but simply eating a diet that's really high in these nutrients can at least help with the recovery process, and then making sure that you have ample supply of those nutrients, which actually is very important for not only fertility, but also for actually, being pregnant and providing those nutrients to a child that's developing. So I always like to make sure that my clients are super well nourished before they even start trying to get pregnant, because nutrients and any sort of nutrient deficiency when you're pregnant is guaranteed to get exacerbated during that pregnancy, and it could be exacerbated to the point where the child is not getting the nutrition it needs to develop to its full potential.
Hmm. I think that it's not that well known that the birth control pill does deplete certain nutrients,
Mm.
and also how important it is to kind of give your body that time to replenish those nutrients before, as you said, before even trying to have a baby. I know I didn't know that when I was younger. Maybe you could give a few examples of some of the nutrients that have been shown to be depleted while women are on the birth control pill.
Yeah, definitely. So as far as the ones that there's actually evidence for depletion, zinc is one of the ones that is most often depleted. Zinc is a nutrient that a lot of people are deficient in, even if they're not on birth control. So if you add in birth control on top of an already zinc deficient diet, then you're asking for trouble essentially. Zinc is high in lots of animal products. So shellfish is the best source of zinc. Red meat is the second best source. Poultry and other meats essentially are going to be good sources of zinc. Pumpkin seeds is the best plant-based source of zinc. Now, one problem with zinc is that it actually can be very difficult to absorb zinc from plant foods just because they have things called phytates in them that bind to zinc. So if somebody's a vegetarian, they're going to be at high risk for zinc deficiency. If somebody's a vegan, if I had a vegan patient, I would 100% put them on a zinc supplement. I don't feel comfortable with the amount of zinc that they could be able to absorb from their plant foods. And then if you have a vegetarian or vegan on birth control, I mean, like I said, that's a situation where I would 100% use a zinc supplement. Now, if somebody's not a vegan or vegetarian, they can get adequate levels of zinc by eating a lot of shellfish. So, I like to say a dozen oysters, mussels, or clams per week, and making sure that they're eating red meat, at least every couple of days, if not every other day, or even every day if somebody's needs a little extra iron or if they're worried about zinc deficiency. So again, the supplementation of zinc can be really helpful because most people aren't going to necessarily be able to eat 12 oysters a week. I mean, as much as we would all love to just go have raw oysters once a week, um, sometimes I find the zinc supplement to be helpful. And you can just take 15 to 30 milligrams per day. And that would be just a general recommendation for anyone who's potentially concerned about their zinc intake. Another mineral that tends to be low in most people's diets in general, and that includes people who are eating an ancestral diet and focusing on getting really nutrient dense foods, magnesium is one that the reason it's usually deficient in people's diets is because our soils have been depleted of magnesium. We're not eating as much plant food as we might normally eat, so combining that together, we aren't getting as much magnesium as we might have gotten even 100 or 200 years ago. So I usually recommend a small amount of magnesium supplementation, maybe 200 milligrams to up to 400 milligrams daily of a chelated form. So something like magnesium citrate or magnesium glycinate are two really good options. There is some evidence that serum magnesium levels are reduced by oral contraceptive use. So that's another nutrient that most of us are already a little bit deficient in our diets, even if you're eating a quote unquote perfect diet. And then if you're on birth control, you're going to have lower levels of that as well. So I would definitely supplement with magnesium, and certainly eating lots of leafy greens and nuts and seeds can help to get some of that in your diet. Vitamin B6 is another nutrient that I've found has been really helpful for my clients that are experiencing post-birth control syndrome. There is evidence that women who use oral contraceptives have lower plasma vitamin B6. So there has been clinical evidence that supplementation with B6 can help with a certain type of amenorrhea. That's the type caused by high prolactin levels. So if somebody's coming off of birth control and they're not getting their cycle back, I think B6 supplementation is a great thing to experiment with. So B6 is one of those nutrients that's found in most foods. One downside about B6 is it's pretty sensitive to cooking. So if you don't eat a lot of raw foods, you'll actually not get as much B6 in your diet as someone who's eating, um, you know, I would say raw milk is a, a great source of it. Uh, Less high temperature cooked meats. So if you're eating medium to medium rare hamburgers, you're going to be getting more B6 than someone that's eating a fully cooked hamburger. Um, I would say for someone that's coming off birth control, doing a small supplement would be helpful. So 50 milligrams per day is enough where you're getting a lot more than the daily needs and you're able to replenish those stores. And it's very not even near toxicity. So I would say toxicity would be 200 milligrams per day. You wouldn't want to be going above that. So 50 milligrams per day is a safe dose. And then there's a couple of other nutrients that I typically focus on with my clients. So vitamin A and vitamin D are two nutrients that one is really hard to get in your diet. So vitamin D is extremely hard to get from the diet. It can be done if you eat lots of fatty fish, mushrooms, but usually you're not going to get enough to make up for what you would get from sun exposure. Now I know our Canadian listeners are probably not getting much vitamin D this time of year. Really, anyone in the northern hemisphere is probably not getting enough vitamin D during the winter. So if you have low vitamin D status, you'd want to be supplementing there. Vitamin A is another nutrient that I think is inadequate in most people's diet simply because it's a fat soluble vitamin and it's only in nutrient dense animal fats. So things like liver is a super great source of vitamin A. Of course, most of us aren't eating liver very regularly. I can admit I don't eat it as regularly as I should. Egg yolks are pretty high in vitamin A. So I typically recommend for vitamin A to be eating a quarter pound of beef or lamb liver a week. Now, if you're not doing that, you can supplement either with cod liver oil, which is a great source of vitamin A, or there are vitamin A supplements if people don't necessarily want to use cod liver oil. So, vitamin A is a really important nutrient for fertility. Um, it's actually also really important for fetal development. So, eating vitamin A rich foods or taking a vitamin A rich supplement like cod liver oil both before and during pregnancy. You have to be a little careful during pregnancy because getting excessive amounts of vitamin A can actually be dangerous to the fetus, but you'd have to be eating a lot of liver and you'd also have to have pretty low vitamin D stores for that to be a risk. So if you're getting lots of sunlight and eating a small amount of liver or cod liver oil every week, you'll be in good shape. And that's something that, especially in our Western diet, vitamin A, I think, is just not represented anywhere near enough. And just to make sure if anyone's wondering, well, what about beta carotene? Beta carotene is the plant version of vitamin A. It's actually not the type of vitamin A that your body can use. Only about 5% of beta carotene gets converted into the vitamin A that your body will use to help with that fetal development. And about 50% of our population can't actually convert enough beta carotene into preformed vitamin A to meet their daily needs. So, if you're on a vegetarian or vegan diet, you may be at higher risk for vitamin A deficiency. Certainly, if you're eating lots of egg yolks, maybe lots of grass fed dairy, butter, that kind of thing, you may be okay. But if somebody, excuse me, if somebody is a vegan or vegetarian, I usually would want them on a vitamin A supplement just to make sure they're getting what they need. So hopefully those are the
Yeah.
basic nutrients. I mean, there's definitely a lot of nutrients that'll affect fertility. I know most of our listeners probably know about folic acid or folate. Folate's very high in liver. So liver is one of those foods that if you're just trying to hit all your bases, eating liver once a week will kind of get you to that baseline. But a nutrient dense diet in general is going to be really helpful for fertility and for making sure that you're ready to have a healthy pregnancy.
I think that's really great that you kind of went through all the different nutrients that can be depleted while you're on the pill and the ways that we can kind of incorporate those into the diet. And I was going to ask you about folate and what the difference is between folate and folic acid. And one of the things that I found, personally, like obviously it's not scientific, but in my life, is that when I actually started incorporating liver regularly into my own diet, it was only then that my nutrient stores, like my blood tests actually started to come back, showing a
Mm.
significant increase. My iron levels were always very, very low for like a decade, like really long time. And so I feel like there's got to be a difference between supplementation and getting it from food. Um,
Yeah, definitely. Well, I always tell my clients that even though we know a lot about nutrition, I would never be so bold to say that we've discovered everything there is to know about food and nutrition. So even though I know a lot of nutrients that are in foods, I would never say that we know everything. There may be some special nutrient that's in food that we haven't discovered yet that makes eating liver different than taking isolated nutrients that you're trying to replace. Now, supplementation can be really helpful, so I don't want people to feel like supplementing is bad or undesirable. Some people really do need the supplementation to get their stores up to where they need to be. But like you said, with eating real food, something like liver, it's high in iron, but it's also high in lots of B vitamins that help you assimilate and store iron. So if you're just taking iron pills, your body may not absorb it as well. Your body may not actually get that iron into your red blood cells where it needs to be. If you're not getting enough B12, which is another B vitamin that is required for forming blood cells, you could be eating or taking iron pills all day and you're not getting the B12 to properly form red blood cells. You'll still be anemic even if you're getting the iron you need. So there's a lot of nutrients that interact. That's why getting it from food is preferable because, again, we don't always know all the interactions. It's only been recently we even knew that vitamin A and vitamin D have a really strong interaction, and getting them in, I don't want to say equal amounts, but balanced amounts is really important. So I don't usually give people vitamin D supplementation without making sure their vitamin A is adequate. Vitamin K2 is another nutrient there that you actually need to be in balance. Um, and then when it comes to supplementation, when I'm recommending supplements to my clients, I always want to make sure I'm giving them the best form of the nutrient possible. The reason for that is because certain nutrients are not as well used by the body. Um, Folic acid is a good example for a different reason than what most synthetic nutrients, the issue with those is. So the problem with folic acid actually is that because your body doesn't metabolize it the same way it metabolizes folate, it actually causes you to get higher levels of uh, folic acid in your blood. You tend to get excessive amounts of the folic acid, whereas folate, your body uses what it needs and excretes the rest. And high levels of folic acid actually put people at higher risk for cancer. So, folic acid is one of those supplements that most prenatal vitamins contain. Certainly, you don't want to be not getting any folate in your diet. I mean, if it was between not getting folate at all and getting a small amount of folic acid, of course, I would point people towards folic acid. But folate is the food-based form of that nutrient, and it's actually more easily used by your body. Certain people have genetic issues that actually mean that they can't utilize folic acid in a way that makes it effective. So if you have something called MTHFR, and that's a rabbit hole I won't go down because that's a whole podcast in itself, but there's a significant proportion of the population that can't metabolize folic acid, and they absolutely need folate to make the same um, chemical reactions that the folate is used for. So, long story short, folate comes in in food form, but it also is in supplement form. So if somebody wants to supplement before pregnancy with folate, that's perfectly reasonable and healthy to do. You can also get it from liver is a super dense source of folate. Leafy greens have a lot of folate in them. Certain legumes like lentils tend to have more folate in them. So you can get lots of folate in your diet if you pay attention. And if you wanted to supplement just to make sure you're getting that 400 micrograms per day, that's recommended for just general needs. And then I think it's 800 micrograms per day for pregnancy. You may want to take a 2 to 400 microgram supplement of something called methylated folate. So that's something I would recommend working with a practitioner to find the right supplement there. But eating things like liver, leafy greens, lentils, those are going to help you get lots of folate from your food.
So it's kind of good to know that there is a difference between folic acid and folate, because some people can take folic acid, but their body won't convert it into folate. So it's kind of like you're taking it and it's not really as effective as you think it is.
Yeah, and then also, we were talking about nutrient synergy. Um, One of the nutrients that's really important to help make sure you're using folate effectively, uh, basically, these nutrients are supporting your methylation cycle. The methylation cycle is something that is critical to fetal development. So if your methylation cycle is not functioning normally, that leads to things like neural tube defects in infants. So that's why the government generally recommends folic acid supplementation to protect against neural tube defects. Now, something that a lot of people don't actually know is that in addition to folate, one of the key nutrients to support methylation is choline. And choline is a nutrient that is actually highly concentrated in egg yolks. Egg yolks are the best source of choline of any food. Um, liver actually is a great source of choline as well. So if somebody can't eat eggs for whatever reason, they can get it in liver. But choline is a nutrient that I think it's like 80 to 90% of Americans don't get enough choline in their diet, and certainly your needs go up in pregnancy. So that's another reason why women who are looking to get pregnant or who already are pregnant should not be afraid of egg yolks, should eat three egg yolks a day minimum, I would say, is a good place to shoot for. So there's again so much information about nutrient synergy that we don't have time to cover today, but I just want to put the word choline in your listeners' mind and make sure they're looking into how much choline they're getting in their diet. And again, if supplementation was necessary for whatever reason, that's an option that people can look into. But you don't want to be eating a low choline diet if you're looking to get pregnant.
Well, we've talked a little bit about some of the dietary, but
Nutritional
yes,
strategies,
so
maybe?
nutritional strategies for handling post-birth control syndrome. So maybe we could just close on, so for someone who's listening, who's recently gone off the pill and, their period hasn't come back yet, they're wanting to get pregnant. I guess to summarize what we've talked about today, when you have clients in that situation, what are some of the most important tips that they can keep in mind when they're kind of on that journey to try to have their fertility, their period return, and also to try to make sure their body's nutritionally prepared to have a healthy baby?
Yeah, great. Well, so I always like to remind my clients that when you're considering getting pregnant, whether that's you're trying to get pregnant yesterday or if you're thinking about getting pregnant in the next couple of months or maybe the next year or so, the amount of nutrients that you have stored in your body up to a year before pregnancy can affect the outcome of your pregnancy. So now I'm not saying you're going to necessarily be at risk for miscarriage or things like neural tube defects, which are serious issues, but even just making sure that your child is neurologically as developed as is possible, limiting the risk of certain issues like autism or other things that can come from methylation defects, making sure that your child isn't at higher risk for obesity or other chronic diseases like heart disease. I mean, it's amazing how much the nutrition of the mother can actually affect the child's long-term health outcomes. So again, I'm not trying to say this as a scare tactic. I just like all my female clients to know that your diet a year from before you even conceive your child is going to affect how much nutrition your child is able to extract from your stores. So if having children in the next year or two, or even in the future in general, if that's something that's on your radar, it's always good to get started on this as soon as possible, even if you're still on birth control. And then, of course, when you're coming off birth control, giving yourself some time before you're trying to get pregnant actively is really good to help make sure you're replenishing those nutrients that might have gotten depleted while you were on birth control. So we already talked about a couple of the ones that were really important. If somebody wants to do it from a food perspective, the quarter pound of liver per week is essentially the number one thing I could recommend as far as getting your nutrient status up to where it needs to be. Eating shellfish or zinc-rich foods, again, another really important nutrient. If you could eat a dozen oysters and a quarter pound of liver a week, I think you'd be set for most of these nutrients that we talked about. Um, of course, eating whole foods as much as possible. Another thing I see a lot, which might be because I see a lot of paleo clients, but just make sure you're not under eating and over exercising. That can actually affect your fertility and affect your period. I've had a lot of clients with something called hypothalamic amenorrhea, and that's something where your body is under a lot of stress and it basically shuts down your period because it's perceiving that it's not an appropriate time to have a baby. So your body's really smart, and if it thinks that having a baby would be a bad idea, it's not going to let you conceive. So if you're not getting your period for whatever reason, your body's telling you that you're not ready to have a baby. And you need to look at not only your diet, but also your lifestyle, making sure you're not under a lot of stress, making sure you're sleeping well, making sure you're not overtraining. So not going to the gym 6, 7 days a week, um, eating enough and not being on a low calorie diet or a super low fat diet. Those are the kind of things that can really affect fertility. So it's always going to depend on the individual, but just eating lots of nutrient dense foods, not restricting any specific macronutrient that includes fat and carbohydrate, and working on your lifestyle to minimize stress. Of course, being active is good. So if somebody's not active, then getting active is actually good for fertility, but making sure that you're not overdoing it in the gym. So like I said, I always tailor my plans to this specific client and based on what they're coming from. If I have somebody coming from a low carb paleo diet where they're doing CrossFit 5 days a week, their plan's going to look probably I wouldn't say the exact opposite, but pretty different than someone who is overweight or obese, maybe has PCOS, maybe was on the birth control pill for PCOS for a while. That kind of client's going to get a different plan. So there's some basic things that we talked about today that everyone I think should have on their radar. And then as far as specifics, depending on your personal situation, there may be some tweaks that might actually help an individual maximize their fertility.
I couldn't agree more. I'm just so happy to have had you on the show today because I really feel like our listeners will get a lot out of this interview and I can't wait to share it. You've provided so much specific, detailed, and actionable things that we can all do to kind of improve our health and fertility. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And I just wanted to mention I talked about liver a lot today. That might be something that's a little scary to most people as far as adding that to their diet. There is an article I wrote on my blog that I think it's called Hate Liver, Eat It Anyway with These Tips. So if anyone's a little concerned about how to get liver into their diet, either by eating it as a food or using it as almost like a supplement, using actual fresh liver, I have some tips on that article. So I would recommend checking that out if you're looking for a way to add in that quarter pound of liver a week without just eating a slab of it every Wednesday or something.
Yeah, no, I love that article because, don't be afraid of liver. There's lots of good ways to incorporate it. And I'll make sure to include that link in the show notes for today. And so before we go today, Laura, how can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to work with you or just to get a hold of you on your blog and find out more about what you do?
Well, like you said in the beginning, my website is called Ancestralize Me. So, and I think you said you'll be linking to that in the show notes. So
Yes.
your listeners can check that out. I do my own biweekly podcast called The Ancestral RDs with my friend Kelsey Marksteiner. We actually just published a podcast about post-birth control syndrome, so your listeners may want to listen to that. And I would say those are the two best places to find me. Of course, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, so if you want to link to that in the show notes as well. And my information about working with me as a client is on that ancestralizeme.com page. So if anyone's struggling with getting their period back or getting their fertility sorted out and you want to get some dietary advice that's specific to your individual needs, then I'm happy to work with you.
Well, thank you again, Laura. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your knowledge and experience with our audience. And like I said, I think that this is a great episode for everyone listening because there's just so much great information there about how we can work towards improving our fertility and our health. And I mean, I always think to myself, it can't hurt incorporating these fantastic fertility foods and nutrient dense foods into our diet. It can't hurt. So
yeah, and like I said before, even if having kids isn't on I would assume your listeners are, pretty focused on fertility because it's a fertility podcast. But even if you know friends, girls that are eating low fat, maybe vegan or, whatever type of diet they're eating, the earlier you start preparing, the better. So even if having kids isn't on your radar for another 10 years, it's still something worth getting sorted now because it's easier to stay nourished than to fix a deficiency. So, if you have daughters that you might want to teach this information to just so they're ready to have children when it's time, it's just something that I really strongly promote it, and it's important because again, there's a lot of women out there that are deficient in nutrients because of the kind of recommendations they've gotten from conventional wisdom, and I'm trying to dispel those myths so that we're having the healthiest children that we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as a mother, your children will snatch all of your nutrients if you don't have enough, because I
That's true.
certainly didn't know all of this before I had my son. So I mean, what else are they made of? They have to come out of us. So
Right,
it's so
right. So,
important.
and the baby's actually when you're pregnant, the baby's kind of the high priority there.
Yeah.
So, like you said, if your body's not getting what it needs, it's gonna steal it from whatever you have available. So, for your own health and for the baby's health, being super nutrient replete before getting pregnant is a really good idea.
Well, thank you so much again, Laura, for being here with us today. I had a great time recording with you. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon. That was a great episode that Laura and I recorded together. And there's just so much great information there about nutrition and how it relates to fertility and what to do to replenish the nutrients that are lost, when we're taking the birth control pill. And so thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please remember to stop by the blog and leave a comment in the show notes. And you'll find those for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/Laura. And in the show notes, I'll make sure to link all of the articles that we talked about. Laura's article about how to incorporate liver into your diet. And we talked about a lot of different topics. So make sure to check out the show notes because there'll be a lot of great information there. And you can find me on Twitter at Fertile Friday. And you can also find me on the Fertility Friday Facebook page. And that's facebook.com/Fertility Fridays with an S. And so thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Until next time, be well and happy charting.